Hi everyone, welcome to Saris on Screen. I'm Usha,
But I'm Rekha.
and we're talking about politics, patriarchy, and pop culture. Catch us every other Friday as we do feminist deep dives into South Asian culture and cinema. In this episode, we'll be talking about sex and sexuality in South Asian media. This is, in essence, the first half of a two-part conversation. In this first half, we hope to address the broader discussions around sex and sexuality in the media in our region. And in our next episode, the conversation will continue into an in depth discussion around queer media.
That being said, a few disclaimers first. It's been really empowering to see so many people speak about sex so candidly these days. This was nearly unimaginable when we were teenagers. Unfortunately, open conversations around sex and sexuality continue to be really taboo in our society. But it's been great to see a segment of people start to chip away at this reluctance to talk about something that's such a fundamental part of all of our lives.
Yeah, and I think there are a lot of great podcasters and YouTubers who share their experiences on this and in like such a better way than we can. And we highly recommend you give them a listen. Links are always on our show notes. And while we absolutely value the importance of sharing lived experiences, in this episode we will specifically look at the media we consume, how it portrays sex and sexualities of women and marginalized people, and how it shapes the greater societal conversations around these issues.
Before we get into the movies that we're tackling today, I think it's really important to clear up this misconception that sex and sexuality are somehow universal experiences. They're experienced really differently by the people experiencing them. And the socio-economic and cultural locations that shape our identities and empower and disempower us in different ways also change how we engage with sex and sexuality in our daily lives.
The movies and shows we plan to talk about in this episode come from Netflix productions, slightly indie parts of Bollywood, and the West Bengali film industry. While the chosen media here vary in their representations of language, socioeconomic class, urban rural spaces, and to a degree caste, I think a common critique for all the movies chosen, and of us as well, is that it mostly still looks at sex and sexuality through the imposed universality of an upper class, upper caste gaze. We will try our best to make note of this as we go through this episode. And with that, let's begin.
I think it's really interesting to note that it was actually the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s when sex and sexuality was sort of forced into the public limelight. It became part of the public sphere conversations and came outside those usual sort of demographic, social, and medical confines that it was in until then. And in the 90s, with rise to access in electricity and televisions, a new brand of more explicit, more raw sexual imagery actually entered South Asian homes and media.
And yeah, and it's not that sex was like invented in the 90s or that people in the subcontinent didn't engage in sex or more non heteronormative like sexuality. This, like, for at least in terms of the AIDS epidemic, this included conversations around like sex workers and gay men. But it's just that after the 90s, it became more of a constant presence in the media that we consumed. And in the 2000s, we saw this, right? There was suddenly more sex on local television and movies. And it was obviously still heteronormative and still patriarchal. But, like, we were at this point in time constantly being showered with, like, overwhelmingly hetero, like, lusty male gaze, like, like, sort of like scenes. Like, we've all seen those, like, Imran Hashmi movies where, like, it's just, like, a lot of rain, a lot of, like, sultry music and everything. But, like, it's just so, like, gratuitous, right? And this is like sort of, like, and also there's always the item songs that accompanied almost every Bollywood movie. And
Right.
these are still like the better alternatives, because in the worst case scenarios we had the gratuitous like violence in like the rape scenes that were in like some of the other movies, where a man gets to play a hero, right, in saving the girls, like sort of like, what is it, Izzat and everything. But yeah, like I think it's just, depressing, like how there was so much sex everywhere, but none of us were allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even though there were more healthy sort of portrayals of sex being created in more alternative or indie industries or even regional media, I think West Bengal is like a notable example where there were more progressive depictions of sex and sexuality. But these were also fairly inaccessible pieces of media for most people. And I think what's unfortunate is that because of how inaccessible these local, maybe more sensitive portrayals of sex were, a lot of us who had the alternative of having access to Western narratives of sex and sexuality were sort of forced to adopt them and cling to them because our vocabulary on sex ended up being completely influenced by a culture that wasn't ours, one that we didn't live in.
Yeah, and I think that it's like really sad, because I think this like goes into sort of the broader issue of like our like post-colonial like hangups, right? We ultimately still rely on like Western institutions, Western borders, and like a lot of these other structures that are like, colonial remnants, because it's almost too much work to come up with our like own, or we just like, we're also just like not able to come up with our own at times because of just like how we're disadvantaged. But even in scenarios where we might have local alternatives, sometimes it just feels easier to slot into these like sort of narratives that are just easily available, even if they don't resonate with us the way something so sensitive like should.
I think it's also because like healthy portrayals of sex mean, or the lack of healthy portrayals of sex means that there is nothing to sort of like use as an example, with no access to our own like sort of portrayals of sex. We just had no other option but to look at Western media. There was no non-slutty alternative in South Asian media that was accessible to us.
Yeah, and like, yeah, and like while like I would have hoped, like, I mean, I grew up in Bangladesh, and I feel like West Bengal was a lot more accessible for me than it was for you. But even then, I think there was still like the sort of like, my mom wouldn't let me watch them because she'd be like, "Oh, there's still sex on it." But my mom didn't
Yeah.
have a problem with me watching Bollywood movies with like some item numbers on it. So like, our priorities and like our cultural priorities made it a lot more harder to seek out healthier content on sex than it did like, like just like worse ones. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the culture pushes that narrative, right? That women are sort of victims of sex always, victims of sex and sexuality, and men are victims of women's sexuality somehow. But yeah. I think we've also been very fortunate that the film industries and the artists have continued to sort of take that thread and keep tugging at it to bring better media. And I think in the last decade, we've seen some very prominent works that highlight sex and sexuality that made it to mainstream success. And in this episode, we will primarily be tackling three movies that we think have done so, beginning with Lust Stories.
Yeah, no, like Lust Stories when it came out, I think was very surprising, because this is like the follow up to like Bombay Talkies on Netflix, which are like essentially like a collection of like anthology sort of type like short films based off of like a common theme. And I was very excited when it came out. I was like, oh wow, like with all these famous directors like Karan Johar, Zoya Akhtar, Anwar Kashyap, and like all these people who are gonna be doing like talking about sex essentially. I was excited.
Yeah, and it was a big deal, right? Like a
Yeah.
movie called Lust Stories coming out of Bollywood. Just that in itself is like a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
And yeah, from this anthology, we decided to pick like I think sort of three specific ones to like talk about, like instead of like all of them. And I think we picked like the Zoya Akhtar short, where it's the story of a domestic worker working at an upper class, potentially upper caste man's house, and they are shown to have a sexual encounter. But then it goes on to show that when his parents come to visit and arrange his marriage to like a, more, appropriate, partner and whatnot, like he just kind of starts ignoring her and just acting like it never happened. And then she just kind of is resigned. And that's like the end of that story.
So the second movie or the second short that we picked from Love Stories was actually directed by Anurag Kashyap, where the premise is that a one night stand between a college professor and her student takes place, and um, it begins as something that should be, about the ethical and moral implications of engaging in something like this, but it actually turns into the professor, who's played by Radhika Apte, becoming really scary and obsessive about the whole transgression, and she's fallen in love with her student, and he's super nonchalant about it. And it really kind of turns a movie that could have been so much commentary into like a really tired like narrative of like a crazy woman essentially.
And I think that what's interesting is that both of these movies kind of touch on like the issue of power dynamics in like sex and like,
Hmm.
exercising of like sexuality. But the thing is that it never does much to like elaborate on it, and there's just like a lot that is still lacking. Like we'll go into it a bit more further, but like there's just so much there that could have been commentated on.
And I don't think they ever like did those issues justice. And of course, we understand that these were short films, so there
Mhm.
was like a limited time. But I don't think that necessarily excuses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
And like I think for like the third short that we chose, we decided to go with Karan Johar, who's obviously the bigger name in like all the whole series. And I was like really like bummed out with this because I really liked his, I mean not really liked it, but I did think his short for Bombay Talkies was a lot better.
it was
And
so sensitive. It was such a sensitively done portrayal of
yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, problematic in a way, but like also like so like it felt like realistic to the South Asian context in a way too.
yeah.
And I think like on where I had high expectations for Karan Johar short, but like it was such a disappointment because it's essentially the story of a woman whose sex life is like, very lackluster, and then she teaches at a school, and then another school teacher, like a colleague, ends up giving her a vibrator, and they essentially reenact the scene from like The Ugly Truth and those other like Catherine Hegel movies where like a woman has like an orgasm in public. And in this story, she like specifically has like a vibrator stuck in her when she has to rush to the living room to talk to her husband and mother-in-law, who like, freak out because they think that she's going insane. And it ends with like her getting a divorce, and then like, being like, oh yes, women can have, pleasure too. But like, yeah, no, I don't. I think this was like a fail. Like in terms of like the other stories in this like, like anthology, like this was the fail. It was
Yeah,
just
it was.
unnecessarily gratuitous. It didn't comment on anything like, that was like, out there and anything. There's
Yeah,
mostly
it only like claimed to be like about women's pleasure or whatever, but like her husband still like thinks that she doesn't have any like izzat because she chose to like have an orgasm in front of his mother. But like, I mean, it was pure like shock value and titillation, and it's something that's been in our media forever. And this movie just didn't do anything new. It just continues to sort of cater to the male audience and cater to the male gaze. And like, it really dehumanizes and commodifies sex itself, like as an activity, and makes it like really dirty.
there's always been this idea like with the simultaneous effect of something being taboo and like also having like a voyeuristic like sort of perverse sort of like obsession with something, right? That's how sex has been in our
Right.
society, right? Like at the same time, while no one talks about it, it's always presented as something that you should have like gained something voyeuristic pleasure out of. And with these scenes, it just essentially makes sex and pleasure out to be something that you need to secretly and like, like just like, grossly consume, instead of something that is an activity that two consenting adults like, both do for like, mutual like pleasure. Like it just becomes like it yeah, that becomes so dehumanized.
While I think Lust Stories, and particularly Karan Johar's short, was a really bad example of sex and sexuality, a movie we watched for this episode that did things better, even if they weren't perfect, was actually Parched, which is a story of three women in a village in a desert in India. And the first one is Rani, who is a young widow, and she's facing sort of the financial expenses of having to marry her son in an area where they practice reverse dowries. That's probably because there's a horrible sex ratio
Yeah,
there.
not as like a feminist like like thing, but like
Yeah, no, just
yeah.
because women are like lower in supply, probably. Yeah. And then the second protagonist of the story is Lajo, who is a peppy young woman, but she's also supposedly infertile, and because of that is struggling with domestic violence and abuse in her home. But she's also shown to be like ambitious, and she has a career and wants to achieve professional success. And the last, and probably my favorite character in the movie, is a seemingly fearless sex worker and erotic dancer, Bijli, who's shown to be a romantic at heart, and she's sort of shown to be navigating her own desires and how society perceives her. And the movie is about like their friendship and how they comfort each other and how they bring each other brief moments of joy in their mostly sad and unfortunate lives.
I think what we both really appreciate about this movie is how like these women were presented as individuals. Like we got to
Mm-hmm.
hear their backstories, like what motivated them, what they aspired for, like what did they want out of their life. And I think like just having getting to see meaningful relationships between women and not, you know, the same like sort of Sex in the City tropes of like slut, fat, a bummer, prude, and then like the main character or whatever. But like it was beyond
Yeah,
this. This was like a female friendship with like sort of very distinct characters with very like specific like stories that had a lot of, you know, it felt, and not to say like, you know, like there isn't substance in like other stories, but like it felt like there's a lot more depth to their identities beyond their like
absolutely.
tropes, right? And I like really appreciated the feminine gaze in this film, and I specifically like appreciated how the director Lena Yadav like shot this and her work with light and
Definitely.
sound, and just like how much she like focused on highlighting the emotional like sort of
Journeys of these women.
journeys of these women, yeah. And I think that that's all great and everything, but I think this movie also does very cleverly, you know, I mean not so cleverly, to cater to an upper caste upper class western gaze by appropriating and exotifying this women.
Yeah, I mean, even just the fact that on the internet we couldn't find out where these women are supposed to be from. Like there some like sources will say it's Gujarat, and some will say it's Rajasthan, and their clothing, their attire, their even their dialect is like a mix of different sort of communities, language and culture. And so I mean, these women are sort of almost made like nameless and like faceless in that process, and their identity, their cultural, social identities are never really sort of analyzed. I think they're mostly just co opted for that cultural aesthetic, you know?
Yeah, and I think that it's just really sad because like you're telling such intimate stories about these women and then doing nothing to remark on their regional or caste identities, because those are such vital parts of like how we experience like sex and sexuality, right? Like how our identities, where we are, what our problems, like material problems are around us affect so much of like how we engage with sex and sexuality. And to sort of like go up their aesthetic and, you know, make sort of like a, you know, feel good story for like upper caste upper class gays feels kind of, you know, shitty at the end of the day, you know? And I think that, you know, this story on the other hand also like, you know, this isn't the only instance of like tokenization. There are also very specific instances of tokenization in the movie. We'll go into it in a bit, but like this, other than that, this movie also has, representations of sex work, which, is better than most movies, because when most movies, a woman is usually just, or like a sex worker is usually just reduced to their profession and nothing more. But over here,
Yeah.
Bijli is like a well-rounded character. She has a background, aspirations, like, wants, like has, sort of like a lot of agency, at least at the beginning, in terms of how she negotiates, like, the time that she puts into her work, the amount that she like wants to ask for and everything, which, is a lot more than like, the usual story. But ultimately, I think that our biggest sort of problem with this movie is that it still felt like sort of shallow. Even though this movie really resonated with us on the first watch, upon reading this article written by Asha Singh on the roundtable,
Hmm.
we kind of realized just like how like little it did, and also realized how much we are like sort of susceptible to be swayed by the upper class sort of gaze that sort of go ups like these like sort of cultures for like this sort of like more deep stories of like, feminism when they're really not.
Yeah, and I mean how easy it is to like stop being vigilant to, these kind of biases in our media. And
Mm-hmm.
I think like we talked about representations of sex work, which kind of brings us to our next movie, which was, a critically acclaimed Bengali movie called Raj Kahini, also later remade in Bollywood by the same director under the name Begum Jan, starring Vidya Balan. But we'll talk about the Bengali movie today. And the story claims to be the story of 11 sex workers whose lives and livelihoods are like facing upheaval during the partition of the Indian subcontinent in 1947, after the end of British colonialism. So the story is about this lady called Begum Jan and her brothel, where she shelters women who are escaping, violence, communal or domestic. And it's about how they have this futile revolt against these newly established governments of India and Pakistan, and sort of the arbitrary nationhood that was imposed in the Indian subcontinent through through the enactment of the Radcliffe Line. And the story is that the Radcliffe Line, which is the border between India and Pakistan, is going through the middle of this brothel, which also kind of is a commentary or like a very straight up like metaphor for how families and communities were displaced with these very like thoughtlessly designed borders. And despite the fact that this movie claims to be a historical retelling that is centered around women, it really barely made an effort to sort of tell their stories or actually give them a voice. And it's really just like a ham fisted allegory for the turmoil and violence faced by the rest of the subcontinent during partition.
Yeah, and I think that, while this movie is still about sex work, another topic that barely gets any like proper attention in like, like institutionally and just in the public sphere in general. Um, I think it just was super cliche and tropey, with the same old like hoarse voice madame who's like, harsh but has like a soft heart. And like, on one hand, the movie's doing the bare minimum by giving the women like, minimum identities beyond their like profession, but these identities or their sexualities are never developed and sort of end and begin at the brothel.
Or like they're always about like a man. Somehow their identities are always related to a man. Like
Yeah.
even the Begum Jan sort of nemesis, like in her brothel, is the girl who's in love with the teacher, and she's like just there to be in love with the teacher and like cause problems for Begum
Hmm.
Jan. Like that's all the identity she gets.
Yeah, I mean, it was still like a box office like Dollywood movie, and I think that, I mean, I had high expectations, like I feel like because there has been really good that came out of like, like um the West Bengali film industry. But this movie really fell short because ultimately, like, even though the story was supposedly, supposed to empower women, it didn't fail to just employ the male gaze like almost in every scene. And, even in just the dialogues that talked about sex or sexuality, it was just so like it was just very leery. It just made me feel uncomfortable at just how like just problematically it was like shot.
Yeah,
And
I
like
mean, it was very obvious that a man made this movie,
yeah,
like,
and
yeah.
it's like, and I feel like when a man makes these movie and when they think that they're really deep, they try to like essentially make it like, oh, like super violent, like gratuitously violent, or just like super like titillatingly shock value sexy. Like it's like, oh,
Yeah.
like there's never any like you can show nudity without it being like sexual. And I think we saw that in like, like in like parched, right? You can have nudity that doesn't have to be leery or voyeuristic. But like I
Yeah.
feel like the male gaze can never accomplish that because a part of the power is like sort of in that lack of consent.
Voyeurism. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. For the men, it's always like, oh, this like woman doesn't know I'm looking at her. And I think that is like sort of the gross part around like the male gaze, especially when in portrayals of sex and sexuality. And in this movie, I think it was just particularly disturbing because the women's sexualities only serve to be on the receiving end of violence, and they never get to really exhibit any agency or like, like
hmm.
individuality other than like, just like the main character Begum Jan, and even then her character is just so like small. Like it just feels like all of the women exist to serve like, a male fantasy for sex and violence.
Yeah, I mean, even Begum Jan's character, I don't think any of the women's characters were done any justice. And I mean, they pretty much serve as these props to what's essentially another partition story, another
Yeah.
tired take on partition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like it was very obvious when you're watching it that this like director Srijit Mukherjee, he was like just very much like he feels good about the fact that he's like, oh, like during whenever history is told, no one talks about the little people, and like I told the stories of sex workers. Like, where is my Padma Shri? Like is that the word name, right? Like
Yeah.
and so yeah,
Yeah.
that's
I
essentially
mean,
the
he
vibe that I got.
clearly felt that way because he made it again in Hindi. So, I
Yeah,
mean,
he
yeah.
made it in. Yeah, that's also another weird thing because for a movie that is supposedly West Bengali set in Bengal, none of them spoke Bangla long enough. Like very little like Bangla was
Oh,
spoken
yeah.
in this, and I think like this was like also like it was just also so bad to watch it even outside of just the basic premise because of just like the how invasive the male gaze was in this movie. Like I remember this scene, like at the very beginning of the movie, we have this character Shabnam, and who's like used to be named Fatima, and she is essentially at this like hospital, like sort of camp tent area where they're like treating her because she was essentially kept hostage and like raped for like months, which is like absolutely like horrendous. But the very first time we get to see her, people around her are talking about how she was raped, but like we never get to see her say anything because the very first thing we get to see is this really gross sort of like camera shot where she like takes off her pants and she is lying there with her like legs spread in that sort of like classic that like that you see a lot in like porn, like where, and it's very much so shot not from like her point of view where you would see like the top of her like knees or something. It's shot the other way around, so it's like, oh look, you don't really get to see her like
Look
you
at
know
this object,
yeah, look at this
essentially.
object. Yeah, you get to see her legs spread, and I think they like like artfully cover like her like like badge on that. But like it's just like it was very bad because it's like, oh, this woman hasn't even gotten to speak yet, and you're just gonna do this to her. Like why? And also, if you're gonna shoot her like that way, then like shoot her in a way where it's like her perspective because she's the one who's like doing this from like
Yeah,
her
I mean,
PTSD.
yeah, I mean they spent like less time on her face than they did on her legs. I mean, it was
Yeah.
very obviously for that like male
Yeah, it was
gaze
very
like
dehumanizing. Yeah. And I think like it was just like, and not just that, I think there's just like, even beyond like there's like, like the unnecessary shots of like legs and like whatnot. I remember this one scene, like I don't know if you remember that one, where like someone's like masturbating and like they're sorry, which is like fine, and we never get a context to why she's doing it at that point, but like, because
Yeah, I
male gaze,
remember.
we have
Yeah.
to see it. But like she literally is like, instead of going through like between her like like you can just put your hands through your petticoat from like the top, like from your like
Yeah.
belly, right? But this woman is literally on the floor for some reason, even though there's a bed right next to her, and she's like pulled up her sari to like go in from the front, and I'm like, that seems really inconvenient. Like I don't know why it's being done that way, like when you could just like you just have so much more access. And it just like the choices just make it so obvious that like the directorial choices on how sex and sexuality is portrayed just make it so obvious that this is not meant for women. This is meant for some like idea of like like sex starved, like ooh, like women who really likes like are into sex and whatnot, but for like men, like it's very gross. Like
And yeah, there's like so much hypocrisy in even like the script and the depictions in the movie, because Begum Jan is constantly saying how the house where the brothel is located is essentially a classless, casteless sort of utopia and haven. But actually it is really casteist and really classist, because the way the women are dressed, like it kind of, some women are dressed the way marginalized caste or class women are dressed, and they're sort of the ones who are like the queer, like marginalized class women.
yeah, I mean very
But
loosely queer, because like we never get to see them be queer
yeah,
in
I mean,
any other instance other than
yeah.
that one scene where they're making out, and that
And
is
even
it.
that was for like male gratification. Like their queerness was also there for male gratification, you
Yeah,
know.
and it's also like they're the more like sexual people. They're the loud ones. They're the crass ones, which is like that whole portrayal was really gross, because you had the upper caste women who like were like dressed all nice and everything, and sort of seemed to not like
Or
sex. Where
maintain like that sort of
yeah,
sheen of like dignity, even, you know, like the
yeah.
woman who's a mother is
Mm-hmm.
like, oh, she's respectable, she like wears like fully covering clothes. But these like marginalized class women, look at them, their shoulders are bare, and like that kind of a narrative.
Yeah, I mean, there's just this general, very upper caste Hindu male gaze on this movie, which, like, I think that the director didn't want to, like, admit to, but constantly, I mean, he clearly didn't want to admit to it, because he made his main character talk about, like, oh my god, in this brothel, we're all equal. There's no caste and class in this brothel. There's no nationhood in this brothel. But, like, he clearly thought that that was the case, because he thought that that should have been on the script, when he was constantly making like different choices for characters based on whether they were like women of the upper caste or lower caste, or like just like whether if they were like Muslims or Hindus. Like even for the men, I think this is not like particularly about sexuality, but like we saw the Hindu male character in charge of like partition to be a lot more assertive than the Muslim man in the thing,
Right.
right? And this was
Yeah.
just like a constant person. And there was also like the very gross like black brown face black facing with
Oh
like this
yeah.
character called Kabir, who again is also presumed to be like of a marginalized caste. And this is just the problem with like all these like sort of self-professed progressive movies, is that you can tell when they're patting themselves on the back for like having a character at all, but then doing absolutely nothing and then perpetuating the same old stereotypes.
Yeah, and I think the even the men in the movie are sort of reduced to these like cliches and tropes, essentially, because Joya Osan, her character, has a boyfriend who actually ends up saving them at a later point in the movie. But she's having this conversation with him, and he's just, I mean, he knows he's dating a sex worker, but all he cares about is the fact that she's having sex with other people and how that emasculates him. And it's just like such a tired take. And even though there was this sense of, you know, empowerment through language, because she talks about, you know, the bang, she like refers to her like chest and vagina in Bangla, she's essentially having to dehumanize herself to make him feel better, or like
Yeah,
dehumanize her sexuality to make him feel better.
yeah,
For a
and
man, yeah.
yeah, and I think like that scene was very like empowering for me to see, like because like I never in movies we never get to hear women talk about like their like like sexuality.
Yeah, I think it is empowering to hear like conversations around sex and sexuality in South Asian languages. But I also think that that sort of role is left to women who are like considered like less than dignified, or like, who are
Mm-hmm.
sex workers, because it's always like vulgar women who like talk about their sexuality in our languages. When it's upper class women, they're always talking in English, and that's somehow more like sanitized and more like palatable. But like
Mm-hmm.
when it's in our languages, it's crass and dirty.
Yeah, and I think like that, like, and yeah, I think like that's why this scene was like so like important because like we never get to see women say those words, and like I think this is specifically important in the context that in Bangladesh this was a lot of this led to a lot of controversy for Joya, who is a Bangladeshi actress,
Hmm.
and like I think that it was like it. I didn't think that this would be why because like ultimately it wasn't that great a scene because like we saw on the other hand like Parched where we do see like a similar sort of dynamic where a man is in love with like a sex worker, but he is a lot more respectful of the fact that that he knows where she works and he knows that this is ultimately her choice if she wants to like keep working or
Yeah,
not. And he doesn't seem whiny or like sort of like like trying to assert his masculinity through like 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 I will feel like you're more mine if you like stop
yeah,
this without any consideration to asking like can you or will you do you want to stop this. But yeah, no, like I think that there's a lot of empowerment in language, and there's a lot of empowerment in these like small resistances, right? That like I think that when we talk about empowerment there's always a western sort of narrative of like like you must actively protest, you must actively voice your concerns. But like I think we need to recognize that in that empowerment manifests in a lot of different ways based on where you are and who you are, and we should always like applaud these like little moments of resistance, whether it comes in language or like our cuisine or just like our day-to-day like lives. When women make these small choices, it is a big deal, and that sort of
definitely.
empowerment should be like credit, that sort of empowerment should be valued when it is made visible to us.
Yeah, and I think like on the other hand, like a character that was sort of constantly disempowered by the movie and constantly sort of oppressed by the movie and the story was the story of Shabnam, or Fatima as she was originally called. And she never gets to have a voice, and is constantly sort of shown to be a victim of sexual violence and even other forms of violence. I think there was that particularly, I think it was supposed to be a really poignant and provocative scene where Shabnam is like brought to Begum Jan, and Begum Jan, she's like completely like a zombie, completely non-responsive to anything anyone is saying because of how traumatized she is. And Begum Jan like slaps her, like really violently slaps her to get her to start screaming and sort of, have like some catharsis of her trauma. But it felt very inauthentic, and it felt very like, I mean, it felt like a
Gratuitous.
yeah, gratuitous and manipulative, because like that is not necessarily the way trauma can, like, trauma for like trauma healing sake is like just, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. I think like, like with Raj Kahini, it was so gratuitous. And, like this issue of like gratuitous sex and violence is so prevalent in like films and like, TV shows. And this brings us to Lust Stories again with like Karan Johar's short, where it did almost nothing other than to have a very like, male gazy sort of like open, like sort of like public orgasm scene. And that was it. Like I don't think it did much to commentate on like just anything. And there's always the argument that with 50 Shades of Grey, which as subpar as it is, like it mainstreamize sex on movies. If people are willing to go see 50 Shades of Grey on like on theaters in theaters, then they're gonna be open to seeing like something better. And I get that, but in a time in the late 2010s where we've already had better depictions of sex, this just feels just unnecessary. And I think this takes us to like another point where like that we wanted to touch on for less stories, which is like power dynamics.
Yeah, and I think power dynamics, I mean, it's that everything in the world is about sex except sex, which is about power. And I mean, there are so many power dynamics at play every time sex is not only depicted, but also something that people sort of take part in. And Zoya Akhtar's short actually did a very interesting sort of job of like commenting on how pre-existing power dynamics make their way into sexual relationships, because it's about like this domestic worker and her employer having a sexual relationship. That's how it starts. And domestic workers are constantly sexualized in pornography and erotica. And it really sort of undermines that idea of how much they face like assault and violence in the homes that they work in, because that's a constant like fear that domestic workers have to live with. And at the same time, they're also invisibilized by the same upper class, upper caste people who want to sexualize them. And they're constantly in that sort of, I mean, they're in that limbo of being invisible until they are sexualized or until they seem to have sexual value. And that's what the movie is kind of also talking about.
And yeah, and I think that it's really sad because of like how while at the same time they are like sexualized in a very like sort of like problematic way, they are also invisibilized based on when the upper class people need them to be, right? When there's domestic workers who live in people's houses, so they're not seen as bodies that can experience or need desire. These are men and women who have to stay away from their partners for months on end because of their work. They're not given private spaces in the homes that they work in to have time for themselves. And somehow at the same time, it's just really depressing that like these people who are just robbed of like being people who experience sexuality at certain times are also like the victims of such violent sexualization at others. And yeah, that's like a big problem in these sort of power dynamics. And I think that while Zoya Akhtar like tried to talk about sort of the resignation that comes with these sort of issues, she really didn't touch on the sort of greater hypocrisies of society in terms of this. I feel like it was very like it touched on it without really like going into it.
Yeah, and it was like an interesting choice to like start the movie off with like the domestic worker seeming to be like on equal ground as the man she's like sleeping with, and then like showing how oppressed she is throughout the movie, because it started as a subversion of something very interesting and then kind of went into what's a story we've probably like, thought of a million times. And that was kind of really disappointing, I think.
Yeah, and I think that in contrast, like in terms of like seeing like power dynamics in like not like in a very informed way, but at least a better way, we had like Parched, right? But it was interesting to see just like these women exercise like their autonomy within the confines of like their realities, and how they're still able, like it's not that they weren't aware of like their like surrounding or anything. And like I think the commentary of that was at least well done, when it's like, oh yes, like Rani knows that she's friends with Bijli, who's like the sex worker, but Rani also knows that it's not okay to have Bijli at her like son's wedding, where the rest of the villagers will not see it like well.
Yeah, and even Bijli, who's like super open about her work and like her profession, and is able to make some sort of autonomous decisions about her work, is like conscious of the fact that her being publicly friends with Rani has like, repercussions for her reputation as well as Rani.
And I think like other than that, I think another thing to commend the film on is the use of feminine gaze. And we like were talking about it a little bit before, but a more specific scene that we had in mind was the scene where Rani and Lajo are like comforting each other, and as Rani's like tending to like Lajo's wounds after she was like beaten up by her husband for questioning his like fertility.
Yeah.
We do get to see these like sort of scenes where we get to see nudity without sexualization, right? It's not that like it wasn't tender or that it wasn't affectionate or it wasn't like like also like queer coded, but like it was comforting rather than like the goal of it was to show you this very intimate sort of scene that where women find solace in each other rather than to just titillate you or make you feel like you're like voyeuring into like something that you're not supposed to see. They're humanized in that scene.
Absolutely. But I think what, like, while it does a really beautiful job of sort of showing these emotional connections and intimacy between women, it also ends up still sort of catering to the upper class and upper caste and even Western gaze by sort of appropriating and exotifying these women, because when we see these women openly talking about sex or openly, or these scenes with sort of queer undertones, what we're essentially seeing are upper class, upper caste, urban feminist fantasies, and not really the real lived experiences of rural women.
Yeah, and I think that like to touch like briefly on like another element of like this like sort of appropriation and tokenization, there's this one character there who is a northeastern woman who is married to like this a more progressive man in the village who sort of heads the businesses and gives opportunities to women to sell their like artisan crafts to. And so we have this northeastern woman whose backstory is never explored. And the thing is that while this director does value like certain women and their stories to whatever degree without actually touching on their identities either, there's also just this like complete like neglecting of this other woman who was just there to serve as a prop, as like a sort of like cultural prop too.
And she's just there to sort of comment on like how these men are so, you know backward and regressive that they are like objecting to her having work, or like having these conversations around agency and autonomy with the other women. She becomes like a sort of catalyst for their empowerment versus being there for like herself or like her own story.
Mm-hmm. And I think that like this whole issue of like co-opting the experiences and aesthetics of women of scheduled like tribes and disadvantaged castes makes this a particularly callous retelling of the feminist fantasy of sexual autonomy, because it never pays attention to their actual lives and ignores their material realities. Like how you experience and engage with sex and sexuality are very much dependent on how you live. And if you don't have access to electricity or clean water or sanitation, how you relate to sex is going to be very different from someone who has like easy access to these things. It's very superficial to separate the realities of these women from their sexualities and their sexual expressions. It just ultimately ends up being this like shallow feminist fairy tale where the same sort of sexual liberation is available to everyone, just merely tinged by their experience. Like, oh look, she's talking about sex but she lives in like a village and wears like like aesthetic garbs, when you talk about sex, you are wearing jeans and are at an air conditioned room, like, and you both talk about sex the same way. And I think that this really misses the mark.
Yeah, I mean, what you're essentially doing is co opting and appropriating the stories of these women without ever considering that they could be the actual audience of your movie or the target audience of your movie. Because these women weren't like, there weren't women in rural India watching Parched and, having a sexual awakening or like a realization. It was women in urban India or the West, or, you know, privileged women who could like watch this and feel like gratified that, oh, our problems are all the same, like we're just like each other, and like, cause for women, let's all get. I mean, it really just doesn't address the intersectionality of how our identities shape our how we engage with sex in itself.
And you're right that like they're never considered to be the audience of these movies, while their imagery is continued to be exploited for profit, right? And it just feels very bad that even when we get like good feminist filmmaking, we are still these conversations are still limited at like patriarchy, general patriarchy, and financial hardships, but never actually commenting on the lives of these women being affected by global capitalism or Brahminical institutional supremacy, or like, just the like overlapping of all those in how the patriarchy is amplified.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are good things about this movie, obviously. We talked about like Bijli and the representation of sex work earlier, and this and Raj Kahini both sort of touched upon sex work. Um, and like Bijli's character does have a lot more identity than any of the characters got in Raj Kahini. She has some autonomy. She's shown to be, vocal about her desires and her choices in terms of what she's wearing, what she's doing, who she's working with. And she's shown to be sort of like happy, and like she gets fulfillment from her sexuality and doesn't necessarily like cater to the male gaze. She doesn't treat herself as an object all the time. But it's really sad how this story ultimately sort of ends up making her a victim of sexual violence, kind of continuing that trope that sex workers are going to face sexual violence. And I mean, it is realistic. Of course, sex workers do face these problems, but it's so cruel to like repeat that same old story and just show that, nothing better is possible if you're a sex worker. I think that's kind of the message you're left with, and that's just a really sad sort of message.
And I think ultimately, like, like even the good parts and the bad parts, all of it combined, it all comes down to this fact that this was a reorientalization of marginalized experiences to talk about sex through an upper class and upper class elite lens. And this is just not enough. Like, it's not that only documentaries should exist to tell the stories of like people accurately. The movies that portray women in certain parts of the world have the ethical responsibility to show them accurately. And I think that when you're telling these sort of feminist stories and have such good feminist filmmaking, it shouldn't just be a self-serving piece for like international kudos or for rich women to pat themselves on the back for having watched
And like resonated with it.
it.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I think one of the really problematic sort of aspects of this movie, and it's kind of like cloaked under this assumption of, sexual liberation, is when Lajo goes to that cave taken by Bijli and Rani to sort of find out whether she's actually the one who's infertile or it's her husband, and she has sex with this like mystic man. And I think it like really decontextualizes the idea of these, mystic men being perpetrators of violence in reality, because we've seen and heard of so many stories of these god men or like baba or guru type people who are actually sexual predators and sometimes even like child molesters. And for a woman who made this movie to completely like detach from that reality and show this in like this positive like Kama Sutra reorientalizing light was just kind of, I mean, it was really disappointing, I think. Yeah.
And I think what's, like the sort of outside context to this that was also really weird is that this sex scene that we get to see in the cave, it like leaked, quote unquote, onto the
Oh my
porn
god.
websites. And everyone was like, oh, like, Radhika Apte is the actress, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so everyone was like, "Oh, Radhika Apte porn scene leaked," like blah blah blah, and which is really weird because not only is the character in the movie consenting to having sex in this scene, but the actress also consented to be in the sex scene and be publicly seen, right? And it's even when women consent to being like seen, men will try to disconnect them from that little bit of humanity and dignity, right? Because it's a lot less sexier to watch Radhika Apte's scene in Parched than it is to like see Radhika Apte porn scene leaked, and it's just that objectification and disregard of like agency and consent for both the actress and the character in the movie that's so like appalling.
Yeah, and it like makes me think of, all the sort of public like outrage that happened when OnlyFans like had just sort of become popular, and there were all these men who were like being super like, at least on the internet, being super verbally violent and abusive to women just because they chose to like have agency over how they're being sexualized, or they chose to capitalize on their sexuality, which was completely their choice. But men are totally okay with, consuming rape and violence against women. I mean, just like a really horrible example of this is how when any sort of majorly publicized rape case happens, and I know this for a fact for India, it becomes like a trending search on like porn websites. And it's really just like horrible how like women taking control of like their sexuality is never something that's valued by the overarching society.
Ultimately, I think it's just sad how in both these scenarios it's men exerting control over women again. And I think this brings us to sort of like an interesting sort of like resistance that has come as a result of this. I mean, we're not like super well versed on the psychology of this, but I think we wanted to talk about the consumption and the kinkification of submissive fantasies and the ideas of consensual non consent in erotica and media that women enjoy and like marginalized people enjoy. And I think it's very interesting to look at it as a form of resistance in a culture that is so dominated by like men.
Yeah, and it's also like a coping mechanism, right? Where through these fantasies, they have control over something that in reality they don't have any power or like control over.
And these are just like the minuscule ways that people resist, you know, in the face of such overwhelming and inescapable oppression. And this is something that is definitely worth exploring by people who obviously know more on this than us. Um, but yeah, with that, I think we're at a close for this conversation. And we would just want to say that, yeah, we plan to tackle this issue of consent in society in depth in a near future episode. But for the next discussion episode, we plan to talk more specifically about queer presence in South Asian popular media and how it specifically addresses issues of consent, assault, violence faced by queer people. We will also talk about the importance of seeing queer joy in cinema and how to strike a balance between that and the sad alternative that is our realities. We will also talk about rainbow washing and queer capitalist media. So be sure to check that out when that's out.
Thank you all for tuning into this episode of Saris on Screen. Make sure to subscribe and drop us some feedback. We're available anywhere that podcasts are platformed. Make sure to also check out our website and follow us on our socials. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next deep dive, taking on third person singular number, a Bangladeshi favorite. See you then. Bye.